So let's just jump right into it. Why on earth are the absolute best, most accurate artificial intelligence models totally banned from being used by banks for their regulatory capital? I mean, it sounds completely counterintuitive, right? In a world that is practically obsessed with data, you would think global banks would be using the most sophisticated machine learning tools available to predict financial crashes, but they aren't. They literally can't. And in this explainer, we're going to unpack exactly why that is, and more importantly, how a fascinating new framework is blowing that ban wide open.
To figure this out, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to hit 5 main stops. First, the AI black box. Then, game theory meets regulation. Third, decomposing financial risk. Fourth, the visual audit trail. And finally, actionable rules for capital. Let's get to it.
All right, part 1, the AI black box. The core issue here is that regulators like the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank demand total 100% transparency. They don't just want the right answer, they demand to see the exact math that got you there.
If you look at the slide here, you can literally see the friction we're dealing with. On the left, you've got traditional parametric models. You can basically think of these as super rigid mathematical formulas. They are completely transparent. If a bank drops 10 million bucks, this model says, hey, here's the exact variable that did it. Regulators absolutely love them because you can audit every single step. But, and it's a big but, they kind of fall flat when dealing with the chaotic real-world markets. Now look over on the right. Enter advanced machine learning, specifically Gaussian Process Regression or GPR models. These things are unbelievably accurate at predicting market behavior, but they have this one fatal flaw for banking. They're a total black box. They swallow millions of data points and spit out an incredibly accurate risk number. The problem? The pathway to get to that number is this crazy, nonlinear, tangled mess. So if a regulator walks in and asks, hey, why did your model say you need $1 billion in capital reserve? The bank essentially has to shrug and say, well, the AI said so. Obviously, in regulatory finance, the AI said so is flat out illegal.
Which brings us to part 2, game theory meets regulation. How do we actually solve this black box problem and translate that messy AI logic into a language that lawyers and auditors will actually approve? Enter SHARC. That stands for SHAP for regulatory capital. Now, SHARC uses SHAP values, which, funnily enough, come from Nobel Prize-winning cooperative game theory originally developed in the 1950s. Check out this table. It shows how these elegant mathematical axioms translate directly into strict legal regulations. It's actually kind of beautiful. We have 4 main rules here. First up is local accuracy, which regulators interpret as completeness. That basically means every single penny of risk is accounted for by the underlying inputs. Nothing is hidden. Second is missingness. Simply put, if a factor isn't in the scenario, it contributes absolutely zero, so no phantom data artificially jacking up capital requirements. Third is consistency, or monotonicity. This means if a market crash visibly gets worse, the model can't suddenly glitch out and say you somehow need less capital. Makes sense, right? And finally, efficiency. This right here is the holy grail for regulators. It means a zero remainder decomposition. The entire risk number is perfectly sliced up amongst the inputs, leaving absolutely no unexplained mystery. By mapping these game theory axioms straight to the fundamental review of the trading book regulations, SHARC basically provides the key to unlocking that black box.
Moving on to part 3, decomposing financial risk. Think of this whole thing like a massive team sport.
Every input feature in our model is like a player contributing to the final score. And here, that score is the SVaR, or stressed value at risk. That is the giant pile of cash a bank is legally required to hold to survive a catastrophic market crash. As you can see, our model breaks this massive risk down into 2 distinct channels, so we know exactly how that score is calculated. First, we have the mean component. Think of this as the event trigger, or the directional loss magnitude. It is the raw, bleeding drop of a specific asset class. Second, we have the variance component. This is your volatility contribution. It sets the risk baseline. It represents the chaos, the wild swings, and the unpredictability during a crisis. So by splitting the actual drop in value away from the wild volatility, SHARC lets us see exactly, and I mean exactly, what is driving a bank's capital needs when things go completely off the rails.
All right, part 4, the visual audit trail. Time to put on our detective hats and pull out the magnifying glass. We are going to look at visual evidence from 3 extreme stress scenarios to see the inner workings of the AI.
Okay, let's thoroughly unpack this first visualization. This is a SHAP summary plot for a West Asia war scenario, and it is the exact tool an auditor would use to vet the model. Look right at the bottom, along the x-axis. This represents the SHAP value.
meaning its direct impact on the stressed value at risk. Here's the key. If a dot is pushed to the left, it's amplifying the loss, pushing the capital requirement higher. If it's on the right, it's actually mitigating the loss. Now scan up to the top row, the Euro Stoxx 50 mean. You see that massive cluster of dots shoved way over to the left? That perfectly mirrors the scenario we designed. A West Asia war kicks off an energy crisis causing brutal stagflation in the Eurozone. The AI caught that immediately, and SHAP exposes that this Eurozone directional loss is the single biggest driver destroying capital here. But check out the FTSE mean and the Nikkei 225 mean a bit further down. Their dots are actually pushed over to the right. Why? Because in this specific simulation, those markets are relatively insulated from the Eurozone energy shock, so their moderate losses actually act as a buffer for the overall global portfolio. You see, the AI isn't just randomly guessing, it's dynamically weighing complex geopolitical shock lines. And this chart takes that invisible, complicated math and makes it totally visible.
Now let's pivot and look at a completely different scenario, a severe climate risk shock. Notice how the drivers completely flip here. Climate damage isn't spread out evenly, right? It's geographically concentrated. Look at the very top of this chart. The FTSE mean and the Stoxx 50 mean absolutely dominate the loss magnitude. Their dots are jammed way over to the left on that x-axis. But then look at where the S&P 500 mean is sitting. It's shifted over to the right. In this particular climate simulation, the US market is actually acting as a geographic diversification buffer. The model naturally recognized the structural differences in regional exposure and adjusted the risk weights to match. If a regulator looks at this, they can instantly verify that the AI's internal logic perfectly matches the real-world economics of a climate disaster. There is literally no guesswork involved.
And this third chart brilliantly illustrates an AI bubble bursting alongside heavy regulatory crackdowns. Look at what takes the top spot here. The S&P 500 mean is sitting all the way at the top left, way out ahead of everything else. And that makes perfect sense, right? Because the S&P 500 is heavily concentrated with massive technology companies. The AI correctly figures out that a tech bubble bursting is going to hammer the US index the absolute hardest. Meanwhile, the Asian indices, which have a lower comparative weighting in those specific AI stocks, step in as a buffer. So across three wildly different simulations, a geopolitical war, a localized climate disaster, and a targeted tech crash, the SHARC framework successfully traces the AI's internal logic right back to the original scenario design. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that the model is behaving rationally.
So, looking across all three of those incredibly detailed scenarios, we hit this core finding that practitioners love to repeat. Volatility sets the stage, but the loss event pulls the trigger. What they mean by this is a phenomenon called mean dominance. You see, under normal everyday market conditions, volatility, that variance component, is what drives your risk. But as our model proves, when you force a portfolio into chaotic, extreme stress testing, that relationship flips completely upside down. The raw directional loss, the mean, totally swamps the volatility. If an index plummets 40% in a single year, the sheer magnitude of that drop is the binding constraint on your capital. It's not the width of the market swings anymore, it's the raw plunge itself.
Now, how do we actually prove this to a regulator on a single day of trading? We use this, a force plot. You can think of this as a real-time X-ray of the financial model. This one is specifically for the West Asia war scenario. See that number smack in the middle? Negative 2.22%? That is the final stressed value at risk. That is the exact capital requirement. But how did the AI arrive at exactly that number? Well, look at the arrows. The red arrows, pushing from the left, are your loss-amplifying features driving the risk deeper. You can literally read the specific indices and their exact values pushing against the baseline. Then, on the right side, you've got those blue arrows. Those are the mitigating features, the portfolio buffers pushing back. And look at where they meet, perfectly in the center. This right here is the exact visual audit trail that the fundamental review of the trading book demands. It lays out in plain sight exactly which exposures are driving the capital requirement and by exactly how much.
And if we compare the force plots for the climate risk and the AI bubble scenarios side by side, we get to see that fourth game theory rule in action, the efficiency axiom. Notice how the climate risk plot balances out flawlessly at negative 2.10%, and the AI bubble plot meets perfectly at negative 2.15%. Every single basis point of required capital is completely accounted for. There is zero residual mystery here. No leftover AI magic that we just have to blindly trust. The red arrows and the blue arrows sum up perfectly to the final output. For a bank auditor, this is the absolute holy grail. It takes a completely unexplainable black box machine learning output and transforms it into a perfectly balanced, transparent ledger.
Which brings us to our final section, actionable rules for capital. We've satisfied the regulators, we've proven the math, but
But how does a risk manager actually use this on a live trading floor? Because, let's be honest, an explainer is only useful if it actually drives real-world action. Let's turn that high-level math into concrete trading rules. Look at the first row here, capital limit setting. Remember that mean dominance concept we talked about? If the SHARC tool flags that the mean component, the directional loss, is driving over 80% of your risk during a stress scenario, the rule is crystal clear. You have to physically reduce your positions immediately. You can't just buy options to hedge the volatility because volatility isn't the main threat anymore. The sheer drop in asset value is. This framework is also a total game changer for MLOps monitoring. If a bank sees the variance component swinging wildly between reporting cycles, it acts as an automatic early warning system, prompting a review of the AI's core parameters. It completely shifts a bank's strategy from static, rigid limits to dynamic, AI-informed risk management.
And that brings us to the end of this explainer. We've seen how SHARC completely changes the game for regulatory compliance. By borrowing the elegant math of game theory, we've taken the most advanced, previously unaudible predictive models in the world and made them totally transparent. We basically replaced the AI black box with a brightly lit roadmap. So as global banks finally start adopting these hyper-accurate models without the constant fear of regulatory backlash, it leaves us with one seriously thrilling question. What other incredibly complex black box systems governing our everyday lives are about to be blown wide open by explainable AI?